this is the Middle Philosopher. I've touched on in previous videos an implied prejudice between the elves, or more specifically, the High Elves of Valinor and everyone else, that is, the Dark Elves. I'm going to dive more into that, and specifically in terms of why that exists. You see, I had a commenter on one of my other videos say that the elves are believed to have been more in tune with themselves holistically and with the world around them, and that's why actions like the kinslayings are taken more severely than with other peoples. That they have more control over their feelings, with the exceptions of outliers like Fëanor, for example. Now, I definitely could see this point, and it would be a common viewpoint that I think many Tolkien fans would have of the pointy-eared princelings, pardon the pun. That there's even backup for it in the Silmarillion when it talks about how elves perceive themselves overall when compared to mortals, who seem to be quote-unquote more like Melkor and a quote-unquote grief to Manwë. Perhaps they've never seen doors before, because one wonders where they and hobbits fit into that, but whatever. Still, in the same book, there are also implications that contradict that perception as well, particularly between the Noldor and the Sindar during the First Age. Now, it's worth mentioning here that the Sindar, while considered Dark Elves, are also more advanced than other Dark Elves in Middle-earth, such as the Rivalries, or Wild Elves, as some of them are called. And this is in large part due to the leadership and education from Thingol and Melian. And for the Falmari faction that lived next to the Great Sea in Beleriand, the Maiar Ose, and their trade relationship with the Dwarves in the Blue Mountains over on the eastern side of Beleriand. It's said that Menagoroth was the most splendid location in Doriath, and perhaps by extension, Beleriand, before the arrival of the Noldor. Yet, when the High Elves arrive, many of their leaders look down on the Sindar anyway. When Thingol expresses irritation and concern at the appearance of so many potential rivals showing up in his lands, despite the fact they just saved Beleriand during its first war, it's greeted with thinly veiled scorn by some of the Noldor princes. Maedhros, the best of the Fëanor faction, or the Noldor for that matter, mind you, mocks Thingol for being such a powerful king over a land overrun by orcs, and that rather than overreact to the insult, which the Noldor are prone to do as we all know, to just leave him be in his little kingdom of Doriath, and that the Noldor will go everywhere else, because there's nothing that Thingol can do about it, since he doesn't have the manpower, nor arguably the tech to do that anyway. This is a very strong diss when you consider Thingol's background and status. You could arguably call him the High King of the Sindar. I do. And that he was one of the original 3 ambassadors among the first generations of elves to go to Valinor and then promoted among their people when they came back. He ultimately doesn't make it over because of Melian, but even that gives him some credit because she's a Maiar, after all. Now, pause. Dude married a fucking angel, for all intents and purposes, and this does not give him any cred? Moreover, he was close friends with Maedhros' grandfather, Finwë. That at least I would think should have earned him some points. But that doesn't either, apparently. So, why the disrespect? I believe that for one, and to Thingol specifically, the Noldor, or at least some of its princes, find it insulting that any elf would actively choose to remain in Middle-earth and forsake the bliss of Valinor. It's a literal better to rule on Earth than live in heaven scenario. And then, to add to that he would then choose to be king over elves who had chosen likewise, to the prince's estimation, was just even more insulting. Or, to put it more bluntly, the Noldor just basically felt that the Sindar were just dumb, or at least dumber than they were. they were hillbillies to the High Elves city slickers. Even Curfin and Killigrim, to no one's surprise, shared this prejudice more openly in front of Eöl, an elf lord of the Sindar in his own right, if also a recluse, and they openly threatened to kill him if he continues with his sarcastic compliments towards them because they know that somehow he married their cousin Aradhel. Didn't help that they were also close friends with her as well. But for a Noldor to marry a dark elf was much more than just a mark down in station. While other princes were more friendly with the Sindar, such as Finrod, literally everybody's best friend, and even Fingon, who took on into temporary service some Sindar warriors that volunteered for his final campaign against Morgoth, the Noldor still considered themselves the better warriors overall. So basically, many of the Noldor, being raised among the high and mighty of Valinor, saw these rustic elves of Middle-earth as a major step down in all ways that mattered, even those that respected them. Perhaps if they had been more successful against the orcs when the Noldor had arrived, it would have cast them in a better light and a better impression upon them. And the spectrum of this respect ranged from none at all to equal on the basis of being fellow elves, and that's about it. Now, the Sindar were just as guilty of prejudice as the Noldor were, and I think there may have even been some envy towards the Noldor as well. Why do I say this? Again, looking at Thingol's first reaction to their arrival, he isn't thankful or see them as kinsmen long thought lost as some other Sindar did, but rather as I mentioned before, rivals, and more powerful ones at that. Perhaps I'm wildly speculating here, but the only difference I think he saw between the Noldor and Morgoth was that the Noldor weren't attacking him. Yet. After all, he never has his wife drop the magical barrier even before finding out what went down at Alqualondë. Speaking of that battle became public knowledge to the Sindar, and that put the Noldor, for them, under a suspicious light as well. How do you trust someone who knifed your own kinsman in the back after all? This prejudice was just as open as the eastern princes of the Noldor, with the banning of the Noldor language among any of the Sindar, even just hearing it. And the Sindar weren't idiots either. They were well aware of the rivalries between the Noldor themselves, and according to some of Tolkien's other writings, saw them as basically firecrackers just waiting to cook off at the smallest spark. Obviously, they trusted them more than the orcs, but were just as keen to keep their kinsmen at arm's length as well, if they could. Also, just like the presence of the orc armies overrunning Beleriand didn't cast the Sindar in a positive light for the Noldor, neither did the arrival of the sun cast them in a positive light with the Sindar when the sun rose on Fingolfin's Noldor, arriving them in Middle-earth. Eöl most openly expresses this opinion and hates the Noldor for it. If those in his realm were like-minded, then you got quite some resentment stirring up there among the Sindar towards the Noldor. Also, the Sindar, despite not being taught by the Valar, were still very proud of the knowledge that they had gained in Middle-earth. Knowledge that still outclassed the newcomers, and many of them apparently felt that this was not respected enough. After all, what does a city dweller want with the redneck wisdom anyway? There is definitely something to be said of an exception that the Divine had upon the elves for just knowing better because they're the firstborn. And to outsiders, I do think all elves try to push that image forward to maintain their aura of mystery and thereby control of situations when interacting with other races. But to those in the know, like the Númenóreans and their ancestors, I think they knew that the elves were just as bad, if not worse, than they were when it came to discrimination of their own kind. I think the degree of self-control of feelings among elves really depends on which group you're dealing with and what era you're talking about. Even in the following ages, for example, there was an uneasiness among the Noldor/Sindar survivors of Beleriand, and the Elves of the East when they moved eastward in the Middle-earth after the destruction of said land, whom, you could argue, saw the survivors much the same way that Sindar saw the Noldor when they first arrived in Beleriand so long ago. I reference this often, but it's a simple line that carries so much weight when, in The Lord of the Rings, Legolas refers to the Noldor as a strange people. Strange? What are you talking about, dude? These elves are just like you. Hell, we think you're just as strange as they are. Now, I jest, but at the same time, I'm not, because that does pretty much express how everyone saw the elves and how the elves seem to see each other depending on what clan you're dealing with and so on. But having said all that, what do you think? Do you think the prejudice among the elves was warranted? Do you think that this was just a contradiction in the writing that was never completely addressed? Or that perhaps there was some other reason at play? Let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, this is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.